This is a book, and these are books about drugs. Hi everyone, my name is Maddie and welcome back to my channel, or thanks for joining us if you're new here. I hope you all enjoyed my really terrible pun. If you grew up in Canada, or I think it's a thing in the States too, have you seen that terrible, I'll try and cut it in here, that like commercial where they crack the egg and they're like, this is your brain, and then they turn the pan on, they're like, this is your brain on drugs.
This is your brain. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
What does that even mean? What is that warning us about? Like, I don't know. So today what we're going to be talking about is some books that you can read to educate yourself and learn a little bit more about the current opioid crisis that is going on everywhere. So to preface this a little bit, I am in school, and this semester I took a course called the Opioid Crisis, and that was what the whole course was about, and we read 3 novels throughout the class. And to be honest, I didn't know much going into it. Genuinely, I didn't have like many opinions informed about things like safe injection sites, or I didn't know too much about like the war of the history on drugs. I knew it didn't really make sense, but I couldn't articulate to you why. And I've learned so much through this last 4 months that I've been studying this and everything. But I do want to preface this by saying I am in no way an expert. The stuff that I'm saying is stuff that I've drawn from my lectures and from this books, and obviously I still have a long way to go. However, I think one of the most important things that we can do with any social justice issue is to use our voice and our platform and to reach out to people and say, hey, here is something that I don't think a lot of people know about, and let's talk about this, let's have open dialogues, and maybe we can learn from it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through each of the books and kind of give you a bit of a review, some stuff that it talks about, and then I'll probably wrap up with some final thoughts at the end. So the first book that we have here is actually the newest book of the 3, so this just came out in 2020, and it is called Overdose, Heartbreak, and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis, and it is by Benjamin Perrin. So this is a Canadian-specific book. I am Canadian, so of course this class is done through a Canadian context, but a lot of the research and stuff has been done specifically in the States, but there is a lot of good research done, so if you're Canadian, this is a really good book to give you a Canadian-specific perspective. It's written by a lawyer, and he actually does a very good job. Sometimes I find if you get people who aren't really from a like creative writing background, sometimes the writing can seem a little too formal, I guess, or academic, and this does a really good job of being very easy to read and digestible. One of the things that I really like about this book is at the end they really include some like, here are steps or things that you yourself can take, because I think that's one of the things that can feel very isolating and like overwhelming when you're reading all this stuff, is being like feeling so powerless and not really knowing what you can do to help out and how you can make a difference, because sometimes it just feels very small being one person. One of the things that they talk about is getting a take-home naloxone kit. I just picked one up today, so I have one. And essentially naloxone is a drug that can be injected into someone, well, injected or spray, I have the injectable, into someone when they're having a drug overdose, and that can essentially reverse the overdose and save their life. If you're Canadian, at least in Ontario, but I'm pretty sure this is policy across Canada, you can go to any pharmacy and pick them up absolutely for free, and the training can either be done at that pharmacy or it is available online. I will link that information down below if that's something that you're interested in. But yes, this book is a very Canadian-specific perspective, which I think is really important if you're a Canadian, because it helps you understand some of the politics and policies that go around the way that we view drugs in Canada. In particular, I think the politics is very interesting to me in this book, because I just don't understand why drugs are a political issue. So when we talk about drugs, what we're talking about is the process of decriminalizing drugs in order to make it safer for more people. So we're not going to get rid of drugs, we're never going to be able to stop everyone from using them, but we can make it safer for the people who are using them until we're able to get them programs and support that will help them better deal with what is often the emotional or physical pain that has driven them to use drugs. One of the ways that we can do that is by decriminalizing drugs. So there's a difference between decriminalization and legalization. So legalization means that it can be like sold and produced essentially in the same way that alcohol and tobacco is in Canada and now marijuana is. And decriminalizing just means that you're allowed to possess it for personal use and you're not going to get charged for that. But if you're like still selling it or trafficking it, those are still people that we can charge. And in that way, it makes it a lot easier for those people to not be ending up in these like prison stints that aren't really helping anybody and are actually putting them more at risk for overdose, and instead focus on getting them the help and the support that they need. The other things that it talks about in a Canadian context is very focused on BC because that is kind of the heart of where the crisis is happening in Canada, although there is a lot of issues in Ontario as well. And it talks about Insight, which is a safe injection site that is in BC, and some of the other injection sites that have been open and the ways that those save lives. There has never been a death by overdose at an Insight clinic, and contrary to popular belief, they don't spread drug use or make more people use drugs or draw people into the community. Pretty much wherever you have a safe injection site, you're only really getting people, I think it's within 500 meters of that location. Otherwise, the person is often just too unwell to make it there. And they actually help save lives. The number of overdoses that they've been able to reverse is incredible, and of course the more that people go there, the more you can build up to support and then be able to connect them to support elsewhere. The problem is we can't connect them to support elsewhere if we don't have it. That is one of the things that Perrin talks about, is the fact that there is this resistance from policymakers to support programs that decriminalize drugs or provide a safer supply. So that is things like a medical prescription for what is essentially the medical equivalent of heroin. And there's been programs that have done this, and it helps people to function and be more stable, and then they're not putting all that time and energy that they would be putting into trying to find their drugs and trying to find money to pay for it, and they can put that into focusing to getting better and like getting a job and finding housing and all of that good stuff that we want from people. But the problem is there's still this huge stigma around people who use drugs, and that's something that gets talked about in the next book that I will be bringing up. And one of the things that Perrin really talks about is the fact that until we break down that stigma and we convince our policymakers, like, this isn't something that we can be like divided on. It's not party politics. It's not anything else. Like, this is a matter of life or death. This is essentially a war that is going on in our country, and we need to stop making people who use drugs the enemy and instead treat them like human beings and get them the support that they need. So to dive a little bit more into that conversation of stigma, I'm going to bring out the next book, which is Chasing the Scream by Johann. This is an incredible book that I would highly recommend. I know that the author has been critiqued in the past for misquoting people, but with this book he's put a lot of the recorded transcripts online from the interviews, so hopefully that's helped to combat some of the issues, but I do just want to make that aware that there has been some critique of the author for that in the past. I don't know if it was particularly this book or for other ones. And this book is written in a very narrative format, so if you're someone who's used to reading fiction, this is definitely something that you can dive into, and I think that's one of the things that Hari does really well in this book. He's a British author, and the book follows him trying to figure out where this war on drugs came from, like what happened, where it started, and trace that to essentially what he's seen in the people around him in his life. And it starts largely in the US, and then they kind of enforce that through policies and other things on the rest of the world, but it essentially started in the US after the Prohibition. So a Prohibition in the States was when alcohol was entirely banned. We had it in Canada too. We did it for less years. We're like, nah, we want the booze back. We gave up earlier. But in the States it was in for quite a long time, and there was people whose job it was to enforce that, and then of course after that ended they wanted to be able to keep their jobs, so they needed something else to villainize, and they focused on marijuana and this idea of reefer madness, which then became a racialized narrative that focused on minority groups, people like Mexicans and blacks and everything, and basically saying, oh, it's gonna drive them crazy and they're gonna hurt us, so we need to villainize them because of it, which is horrifying and problematic in so many ways, and is a narrative that has continued particularly into when the war on drugs was going on with Ronald Reagan, and the whole fact that that whole war was focused on people of minorities and just assuming that they're the kind of people who are going to use drugs and not focusing on the fact that there is a bulk of white people who do this as well, but no, we're just gonna be racist about this. So that's where this story begins, but then from there it goes on looking at what has continued over time and how pervasive it's been over history and why 100 years later we're still trying to get rid of drugs even though that's not something that's feasible, and everything that we have been done by prohibiting it is making it worse. It's like when your parents tell you that you can't have something and then you immediately want it. That's basically what we've been doing with drugs for the last 100 years, not to consider the fact that it's like impossible to remove all drugs from the market. One of the things that Hari does though that I did want to talk about with this book is stigma, is he really looks at the human aspect of it. He sits down with people and has conversations with them, and just the amount of turmoil that you can read in their words and in their quotes, and you can just see the way that this thing that we've decided is evil is ripping apart people's lives. And when you get to the root of it, the question is why? And there isn't really a good answer. It's kind of ridiculous, like when I think of the education that I got, and it's just like, just say no to drugs, drugs are terrible, they're awful, and there's nothing about like how to support someone that you know using drugs, or like what are the resources available if someone you know is struggling with an addiction. It's all just like, don't do it. And it's really easy to see how that ignores the fact that this is happening and how we help the people who are struggling get to the other side of this. So it's a really good first look at breaking down that stigma, opening those doors, having those conversations. And that's one of the biggest things, is just like being able to talk to people about this, which is part of the reason that it was important to me that I make this video, because I want to try and share some of the knowledge that I've learned and hopefully help break down some of the stigma that other people might have and point them to the people who have done the research to actually read about and learn more about. After that, the last book that I have is by Gabor Mate, who is a Hungarian-Canadian doctor, if I have that right, and it is called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And this is more a look at understanding what addiction is and how it functions in people's brains. And this is really interesting to me because I definitely was raised with that idea that addiction is a genetic thing, that like if you're predisposed to addiction, then things like alcohol and drugs and that are going to be dangerous for you, and then it's also bred into the drugs that once you use it you get hooked on it. And the narrative is actually so much more complicated than that, but a lot of it is really centered in trauma. And Mate talks about these adverse childhood experiences, which are basically like negative life experiences in childhood, and the way that those are actually what we should be looking at and supporting children and getting them help when they're dealing with these traumatic events in order to help them learn healthy coping mechanisms so later in life they're not self-medicating this emotional or physical trauma with drugs. And that's a whole narrative that's missing. I think Perrin uses a quote where he says like, we don't have a drug problem, we have a pain problem. And that's one of the things that we're losing community, we're losing connection in this digital age. And that's something that has really aggravated the drug crisis and made it worse. But the Canadian books in particular, something else that I do want to highlight is they look at the affliction of the opioid crisis on the Indigenous population. Unfortunately, the history of colonialism and trauma in our country is ridiculous with the amount of horrid things that have been done to Indigenous people, and that puts those people more at risk, and we need to make sure that some of the programs that we are using are rooted in Indigenous understandings of healing and spirituality in order to be able to support people to the other side. A few other things that I just wanted to highlight. I'm trying to keep this video not me just being a 3-hour lecture, because like I said, I'm not an expert on any of this, but I want to point people to resources where they can learn more about this, because that is one of the things that I love about reading, is it's able to expand my horizons and teach myself new things. I think just one of the most powerful experiments that they talk about in the book, and that I would also direct you to read more about if you're interested in this or you want to learn more, is they talk about the Rat Park experiment. So this was a Canadian experiment that was done by Bruce Alexander. So essentially it kind of is based off this idea that we just assume that people are going to become addicted to things, and if we actually look at the history, that's not true. So in Vietnam, for example, most of the soldiers were using heroin, and the States was freaking out because they thought, okay, all these soldiers are going to come home and we're going to have a huge heroin addiction problem. But what happened was the soldiers actually came home and just stopped using heroin because they didn't have the trauma of warfare going on around them that they needed to self-medicate. Obviously that wasn't true for everyone, but the bulk of soldiers just stopped. And this experiment essentially took rats and they put them in like basically prison cells, like these terrible environments, and gave them regular water, like, and then water that had cocaine in it. And obviously they would go to the cocaine water because they weren't stimulated, there wasn't anything interesting happening in their lives, so there was that desire in their brains to get high, to escape from the environment that they were in. And then they built what they called Rat Park, which is essentially like paradise for rats. Like, you have all the nice rats of different genders that you can go and hook up with, and they painted the walls really nice. There was lots of toys for them to play with, food, stimulus, everything that they needed to live happy, content rat lives. But they still had the option for them to drink the water that had the cocaine dissolved in it. And even when they took the rats that were previously addicted and put them in that environment, they just stopped drinking the cocaine. And that basically shows that so much of what addiction isn't something that is wired into your brain. There is an element of that, but so much of it is these environmental factors of having the support, of having someone to coach you and to make sure that they're looking after your well-being, mental and physical and emotional and all of that stuff, so that you can thrive. And we need to create communities that give people that space to thrive and understand that people have these really difficult experiences that they're trying to heal from, and stop blaming them for the ways that they used to heal and actually get them support that helps them heal. And of course that's going to be a really long process, and we don't have all the support systems in place, and that is aggravating, but we can start with little steps. And little steps are things like me going to get my naloxone kit, so I have one on me just in case. I don't know anyone personally who uses drugs who's incredibly close to me, but hey, I don't know where I could be, and maybe I'll be the right person at the right time. Something else that you can do is just educate yourself, and that's what this whole video is about. Feel free to check out any of these books. They're all available at major bookstores. I will probably put the titles and authors down below if that's something that you're interested in reading more about. But yes, before I go on another ramble, I hope this was a good introduction to the topic. Obviously, I've been steeped in this for the last, I guess, 3 to 4 months now, so this is something that I've been having active conversations about, so I was trying to give a primer. If people have questions or are looking for other resources or supports, feel free to leave a comment and I will try to help you the best that I can, but obviously I'm also not the person to be helping you with that. Some other great organizations that you can check out that might be able to answer those questions, well, will definitely be able to answer those questions a lot better than me, is Mom Stop the Harm, and I believe it's the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs. If you're in BC, there's VANDU, which is the Vancouver Association of Drug Users. So I will link to all of those websites and good resources down below. Yeah, if you guys kind of like these educational videos, please let me know and I'll be keeping you in the loop on what I'm reading in class. But otherwise, that's everything that I wanted to talk about today. So if you liked this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up or leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next video. There's my Goodreads and art Instagram linked down below, and make sure you subscribe and ring that bell. Until then, I hope you're all doing well and stay kind.